So I am an artist. I'm also a chemical engineer. Made pesticides, antibiotics, insulin. I've made silicone products. Have worked in manufacturing as a chemical engineer. I've also worked in state government in a senior position to try to work on the regulatory programs. For about the past 15 years, I've been in the public interest side of things, working on more chemical policy in the United States. So I appreciate the opportunity to come and just introduce you to some of the issues we've got going on here. My focus is, I'll give you an idea of what's on the radar. And the short answer is, food contact materials are actually lower on our radar screen at this stage, not because they're not important, but because we've got enough other problems that we haven't gotten to them yet. I do know that by this end of this month or next month, it will be coming back on the radar screen, and I'll introduce you to that. We're going to compare US and Europe's approach. It's always a little difficult for somebody from the United States to come over and explain how Europe operates. It's actually really dangerous. So I will give my impression, which may or may not be wrong, and you can correct me. Then I want to talk about 4 packaging chemicals of special concern. Highlight one of our focuses on looking at the cumulative effect in terms of kids' brains and the developmental problems that may be affecting kids' brains. And you're going to hand me some nice little clicker that will work wonderful for me. Thank you. And then I'll do a quick summary. So right now, what's a priority in the United States is implementing the new law called the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act. Then we're going to talk about GRAS. You may have heard of GRAS. It's become clear. And while I was at the Pew Charitable Trusts, we had a team of 6 doing a research project to try to figure out how is it working. We've published 6 articles, and I'll give a quick summary of that. We're going to look at modernizing FDA science, and then some specific direct and indirect additives. Oh, got to go back. So this Food Safety Modernization Act, what it really is about is making sure that the rules are complied with. It is a compliance mechanism where companies have to, in a systematic way, assess what the rules are, where the threats are, how we minimize those. And it gives FDA the authority to enforce the law, because in large part, it was authority before it was limited. It was based on how it was in 1938. There are 4 rules. One is about produce and pathogens in produce. Another one is hazard assessment and risk management preventative controls for human food and animal food. Those are 2 separate rules. And those are important because they also affect food contact substances and additives. But the primary focus is on pathogens. The last one is making sure that foreign suppliers follow the rules for importers. That's actually more China-focused than Europe-focused. So talk about GRAS just for a second. In 1958, Congress said FDA must provide pre-market approval for all food additives. And a food additive includes everything that goes into packaging that might get into food. So packaging chemicals were thought of as additives under the system. But in it, they put in 22 words that created a loophole that's called generally recognized as safe. And it says that industry can make the safety decision and determine it's safe if it is generally recognized as safe. And it was meant for oil and vinegar and common stuff. But it's been used now, so it's expanded about, we estimate out of the 10,000 chemicals that are in either packaging or in additives that we can identify, about 1,000 of those have not been reviewed by the agency. My guess is about half of those are food contact materials and half of those are direct additives or processing aids, chemicals used in the processing. What happens is it allows the company to decide that the additive is safe. FDA doesn't necessarily do that unless it wants to step in. We did a review where I was previously at the Natural Resources Defense Council and identified 56 companies, about a handful of those were European, marketing 275 additives is generally recognized as safe, and they expressly made it clear they did not reviewed by FDA. They were not reviewed by FDA for safety. Most of these were botanical extracts, things that go into what we call dietary supplements, that They were going into dietary supplements, and the company was trying to expand the market into conventional foods. You might think of those as the better for you. Some of the things we learned in the studies, the toxicology studies the companies were doing were a little weak. One of them was a mood-enhancing additive. And the company's study, scientific study, was they fed it to 20 people, and they all said their mood was enhanced. That was some of the toxicology that the companies used. Other ones, it was incredibly rigorous. It's all over the place. But the companies are making the safety decisions. And then the other thing is, it's not that grass is less safe per the standard. The safety standard is not less safe. It's who makes the decision is what's different, and how public that decision is. So companies, FDA since 1997 has voluntarily invited companies to submit notifications. In that, 20% of the notices that are voluntarily submitted, you think they're better than the rest, right? If you're turning them into the government, 20% of those were inadequate, and most of those were withdrawn, and some were rejected. What we found is 22% of those were made by a company employee. A company employee said, I believe this is safe. About 13% of the time, it was a consultant that they hired, and the balance was expert panels that they convened. But what we found is 1 of 10 people served on 75% of those panels. So a small group of, I know several of these scientists, they're very good scientists, dominate the system. So what you end up is groupthink, and in large part, especially for the ones not notified to the agency, these are done in secret. They're not public what happens. We only found them by going to trade journals and expos and checking out the advertisements. What the issue on this is a conflict of interest. A company employee making a safety decision in secret is a conflict of interest, and we've documented that in the Journal of the American Medical Association article. FDA is planning on releasing guidance to say what a conflict of interest is and set some standards. It wouldn't be a rule. The problem here is that this relies on professional judgment. If you had a robust data set for everything, then the room for professional judgment and conflicts of interest are less. But when there's a lot of professional judgment, it's a bigger problem. There's also a lawsuit saying, FDA, you've got to fix this system to the extent they can. But the problem is fundamentally the statute. Here's just a flavor for how it is to be at FDA. There's 110 people responsible for 10,000 chemicals. This is what they did in saying, we've got a problem with your notice. He said, we cannot require anything, as this is a voluntary program, and we don't want to frighten anyone away. Having said that, we would typically tell a notifier that the submission would have to address total dietary exposure. The company said, I only want to address the exposure from my use of the chemical, not all my competitors. And I don't want to consider all those other exposures. And FDA said no. That's a difficult position to be in as a regulator, where you don't want to frighten away the people because then they won't tell you what's going on. So how does it affect the science? Well, if you're worried about frightening people away, are you going to be pushing the envelope on the science? Probably not. And that's what's happening. We see EFSFA pushing the envelope, but we see FDA pulling back. And we'll talk about an article that we published, Marisol Maffini. Anna, you've been her mentor for many years. And she and I and others wrote an article that looked at, it was in the industry's trade journal, or their food industry's journal. And we identified a 1982 report that was prompted actually by President Nixon, who was the last president who was really focused on food safety in the United States. And what they did is they said, here are areas you need to work on. And what we found is most of the areas to FDA to work on had not been implemented 30 years later. Some of those are behavioral impacts. The OECD, EPA are way ahead of FDA. FDA is still dealing with behavioral impacts on a case-by-case basis. Endocrine systems, to be honest, FDA is in large part in denial that they don't know how to deal with it, and Pete covered that a little earlier. Subpopulations, they don't really deal with subpopulations. It's generally 2 and over. They do some look at subpopulations, but it's not nearly what EFSFA does. They have put into rules toxicological insignificance, at which there are no tox studies needed. And personal bias and conflict of interest, these were all raised in 1982 as issues, and there is no reassessment. Most of our food contact materials were approved in the 1960s, so a long time ago. Then we published an article that you referred to, Birgit, earlier in Reproductive Toxicology, where we compared the list of additives to the databases, toxicological databases. We started with FDA's own toxicology database for direct additives, and only 20% of the direct additives had toxicology data in their own database, and that included unpublished studies. And many of those were LD50 studies, which means how much of a dose does it take to kill half the population of rats. Not very good at setting safety standards. About 10% actually had decent studies. We also looked at other databases, publicly available databases, you know, on the National Library of Medicine and ones that are developed by the National Institute of Health. And what we found is that 21.6 of them have feeding studies of any type. We ruled out professional judgment studies. But what that means is that most of these chemicals haven't been studied. So when we talk about toxicology or computational toxicology, it feels a little bit like GIGO. I'm old enough to remember GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, that if the data you're using is not robust, the conclusions you draw is not robust. And what we found was most amazing was FDA said there are some chemicals that the exposure is high enough that we think there should be reproductive and developmental studies done. Yet FDA's own database only had studies for 12.5% of those. So 7 out of every 8 chemicals that FDA said the exposure was high enough to warrant this, and they said that in 1982, didn't have any data. There could be data, but FDA didn't know about it. Here's overall, we compared it to all the databases, and what we found is that 54% of the direct additives didn't have data. Decisions were being made based on professional judgment. It looks a lot like this one, without the rigor that may come from an in silico analysis or an in vitro analysis. So one last thing. In prompting, because of our reports that were pretty critical of FDA science and some concerns, FDA did an opinions survey of its own food scientists. And that opinion study was published just in August. And one of the consultants that they hired to review those surveys said, my goodness, this is a problem. That the scientists in the agency didn't distinguish between the risk assessment and risk management, because in US, the same people make those decisions. So they were blending the issues. That they were missing some of the basic concepts about weight of the evidence and a rigorous scientific assessment. They didn't understand the difference between what the data requirements are with how to review it. And the stunning one was that many of the scientists felt that it was not FDA's job to use the latest science, that they should wait until all the battles between the scientists were resolved and it was well embraced before they should use that to make scientific decisions. And that, I think, is what you saw, Pete. So I want to talk about some specific direct additives, only just to give you that on the radar screen. Trans fat is up there for us, because it's used based on a generally recognized as safe determination made by industry. FDA says it's not. Institute of Medicine says there's no safe level exposure. So FDA is saying we don't think that it should be in food. Caffeine. I think some gentleman asked about caffeine earlier. Well, yeah, I was concerned with alcoholic drinks and its impairment of judgment, but the biggest issue is they're now putting caffeine in waffles, jelly beans, syrup, and you can go to the store and get a shaker, like a salt shaker, of pure caffeine. And there's some concerns. There was an article in the Washington Post that it was attributed to killing some teenager, because teenagers do what teenagers do. There's also concerns with artificial colors, and I do think that crosses the ocean. And corn is our big issue. It's a fungal protein that's a substitute for meat that many people are allergic to, so allergic reactions. I'll get to more of these later on. On our radar screen for food contact substances is bisphenol A, obviously. Also perchlorate, rocket fuel, long-chain perfluorinated compounds, and then orthophthalates. We'll get into those in a minute. So just to compare, to make sure you can tell me when I misunderstand, but I want to talk about what does safe mean, who evaluates it, who makes the decisions, a little bit of the distinction between direct and food contact materials, and then FDA's scientific assessment of packaging. To me, the safety standard for things that you intentionally put into food are the same across the ocean. You call it the precautionary principle. In 1958, Congress said it means you don't add it until there's reasonable certainty of no harm in the minds of competent scientists. It's pretty much the same in practice. The other one is Congress said you must consider the cumulative effect of all pharmacologically related substances. To me, that means that if you've got chemicals that all affect the hypothalamus, for example, you can't take each one separately. You've got to figure out which one, how to add them together, even though it's hard. In Europe, they've got the precautionary principle. This is from the rules, and it has the probable cumulative toxic effects. It's different way of phrasing it, but I think the effect is largely the same. But reasonable certainty of no harm only applies to food additives, intentionally added. Who evaluates the science? Well, theoretically, FDA. But in the United States, it's almost all the new additives now are not going through FDA review. If they are going through FDA, it's voluntary because they can go through the grass. That when a company wants to keep its innovation secret, they grass it. They generally recognize as safe it. They manage to publish a study. I've not been able to find those published studies, and then they can put it on. All of our flavors have gone through that way, 2,700 of them. In Europe, EFSA conducts a safety assessment. And again, in FDA generally makes a decision unless it's generally recognized as safe, and here you have the European Commission. Until 1997, the US had the same system for food contact materials and direct additives. In 1997, Congress created an out that said, if you come to me with a particular plastic or a particular food or additive for packaging or paperboard, you send it to me and I will look at it and I will either object or not object. And typically, if companies see an objection coming, they withdraw it. So that is the primary mechanism since 2000. In Europe, the focus seems to be on plastics and not as much on the others as far as the system. It's the standards, the EFSA work seems to be really heavily focused on plastics. That's my impression. So FDA is trying to reassess it. They do consumption factors and say how many people eat food out of polypropylene, how many people eat food out of paper, and they set up consumption factors. Unfortunately, those factors are only based on final packaging and never consider all the bulk packaging that's used to move the food through. It also has been, FDA has acknowledged that it needs to be updated. The other one is migration testing. If it is dry food packaging, migration testing by and large is not required in the United States. So you can assume not toxic and you can assume no migration. Toxicology requirements depend on exposure. It's a tiered system. Okay, I want to switch gears now and talk about 4 packaging chemicals to try to move along on it. I'm going to start with one that you may have heard about today, bisphenol A. And I don't need to go into more depth on it, but right now in the United States, we pushed on FDA, the public interest community pushed FDA to make a decision, and FDA made a decision that wasn't popular with the public interest community. But what we're doing in the United States is basically sitting back and waiting for the clarity study that Pete referred to be finished. Let's see how the $30 million investment in a rigorous safety studies will come out. We have been seeing some things that Pete and Anna, you alluded to, that raise concerns for us, but we're waiting to see how those studies come out. We are concerned that FDA jumped the gun and looked at a preliminary study and said everything's safe, which seems odd in a large program to jump the gun like that. Perchlorate. There is a European company that adds perchlorate to plastic, and FDA approved that in 2005. It's for dry food. The levels of perchlorate are around 1% or as high as 4%. 4% of the plastic could be perchlorate. So what's the problem? It's to reduce static charge in the dry material so it moves out of the package easier. Our concern, and they also approve it for rubber gaskets, and our concern with that is the application from Ciba Specialty Chemicals had an 83-fold math error in it. And FDA, when they announced it, instead of 1.2% limitation in the final product, they wrote 4%. And the problem is not just Ciba Specialty was bought by BASF, but they're using it, but other companies, read Chinese companies, may be using that same approval to get on the market. So we're concerned about perchlorate being added to food after 2005. What's the problem with perchlorate? Everybody recognizes it as it's an acknowledged endocrine disruptor. It blocks the thyroid's uptake of iodine. So if the woman, if you think of it, a pregnant woman or a nursing woman doesn't have enough iodine, which is pretty common, 30% of the women don't get enough iodine, then the fetus will not have proper brain development because the thyroid is not making enough of the thyroid hormones that are essential for the brain development. That's important for us. So we're getting ready, the public interest community is getting ready, maybe next week, to petition FDA to reverse that approval to force BASF to pull its Ergostat P18 product from the market. Because we don't think perchlorate should be added to food, given it's a clear endocrine disruptor at very low levels and permanently can alter the child's brain development. The next one is perfluorinated compounds. Largely off the market, right? There's a paper guy here. You're not using perfluorinated compounds much anymore in the paper industry, right? Right, most people have gotten out of it. But the US has it still written into the rules that it's allowed. There's 5 categories that are still specifically allowed, which is not a problem because 3M and DuPont and Clariant and BASF have gotten out of the market. However, India and China have ramped up production, and we're concerned that they're going to start using that exemption that's built into the rules. And the problem is, because it's built into the rules, FDA would never be told. And while we know that many paper companies and many buyers are very vigilant now, we're worried that the guard will be let down in the future when we think the product's gone away. So we're going to be asking, probably in the next couple of weeks, to have FDA remove these approvals. Seems obvious, right? Well, the problem is, it would be the very first time. I only checked back to 1982. It would be the first time in 30 years that FDA has said no and reversed an approval. It would set a precedent that would be important for us, and it seems like a good place to set that precedent. Because the other one we're worried about is phthalates. In the United States, children's products are now not allowed to have phthalates unless they're food. Food is allowed to have phthalates in it, so we're concerned about the phthalates that are in it. We had an expert panel that Congress asked the Consumer Product Safety Commission to convene. That panel came back and said 3 to 8 chain phthalates, carbon chain phthalates, alkyl chains, we need to get out of food. We need to get out of consumer products, and they need to be out of food. We're looking to ask FDA to do that and to look at other orthophthalates that are linked to developmental problems. So we are going to be moving on that in the next couple months. Finally, and that's the joke, right? To pull me over, kids' brains. We are framing our issue because we're wrestling with some of the same issues you are. Developmental disorders in the United States are going up 15% in the past 15 years. That's not genes. Now, some of it is diagnosis, but when they drill down into the data, it's not diagnosis. And we're not talking about developmental disorders like blindness or deafness. Those are stable or going down. We're talking about autism, other behavioral problems. And those are going up. So we're concerned that there are chemicals in food that may be contributing that. So what Marisol Maffini, Dr. Maffini and I have been working on is we've gone through and said, how could you do it right? Because the law says you have to consider pharmacologically similar substances or related substances. So we don't see EU or US doing this. So we're suggesting that why not take FDA's database? And anytime at relatively low levels, the study said it messes up the thyroid or the brain or the hypothalamus, and saying we should figure that out. Kids' brains are valuable enough. And what we found is there were 44 direct additives and many more food contact materials. Well, in FDA's database was only direct. 44 direct additives where FDA's own database said these affected the brain, hypothalamus, or thyroid. Then Europe, EFSA, has done an amazing study. On pesticides, they went through and said, of all the pesticides, which ones are associated with the nervous system or the thyroid? And again, because thyroid affects nervous system development. And they identified over 100 pesticides, 106 pesticides. So they've put it in there and said, we need to think about the cumulative effect. That gives us about 144 with some overlap. And then in the United States, there was the Tox 21 program that FDA is involved in. And what we did is we drilled into the data and said, for that cell-based study, which chemicals mimicked, or inhibited, or activated thyroid receptors? Which ones mimicked thyroid hormones? And in that one, we were able to identify 66 direct additives and 107 chemicals that are food contact materials and 86 pesticides. So if you're looking at how to follow the law and look at pharmacologically related substances, this seems like a pretty good list when you're thinking about one of our most treasured assets, our future, our kids' brains. So in summary, we think chemical safety assessment needs to be done without this. We have to minimize and disclose the conflicts of interest. It can't be done by a company employee in a secret, and FDA's acknowledged that. Second, we need to do a cumulative risk assessment that thinks in terms of the body, not in terms of the single chemical. And third is we have to look back. Of the 10,000 chemicals, about 7,000 were approved back in the 60s. Thank you.